Don't forget to sign in.
Okay.
Lemon.
Okay, we're going to start today by looking at a PowerPoint for the Scarlet Ibis. Some of this will not apply to us, but I thought it might give you a better idea of the story itself. The story has so much imagery and descriptive words in it, so this might help you understand what some of them mean. Okay.
Miss, we upload this PowerPoint on SMS?
I don't know yet. The story has a project on it, and we don't need to do the project, so I'm not sure I'll put it on there. All right, Hearst refers to a number of trees and flowers by the local names that he learned as a boy. Oh, wait. Okay, the bleeding tree is a type of a pine tree from which white sap runs like blood when the bark is cut. Graveyard flowers are sweet-smelling gardenias, which, because they bloom year after year, they're often planted in cemeteries. The frayed twigs of the toothbrush tree were once used by people to clean their teeth after eating. All right, here's a picture of the bleeding tree and the gardenias. Okay, you can see how the bleeding tree has this sap that drips. So they've referred to it as the bleeding tree. This is the gardenia flowers. All right, the next slide, point of view. Of course, there are several types of points of view that a narrator can have in a story. Which point of view is this story told in?
First.
Who's telling the story?
First person point of view.
First person.
Yes.
First person.
Okay. Tone word. Example. Okay, quotation. Quotation from paragraph 1 that proves it. Tone word is negative. Cite the paragraph number. The tone word is gloomy. It was in the clove of seasons. Summer was dead and autumn had not yet been born. We discussed this in class. Summer was over with, but fall and winter had not started. So it was between the seasons. It was gloomy. Imagery. You know what imagery means? It refers to one of the five senses: touch, sound, smell, sight. See, this is why I'm not putting it, because you don't have to do all this. There were just some things in here that I wanted you to see. Characterization, you should understand now what characterization means. Symbolism. Lots of symbolism in the story. So you need to recognize what symbolism is in the story and what does it symbolize. Of course, you already know it's an object, person, animal, event, or thing that stands for something more than itself. For example, the dove stands for peace. A cross stands for Christianity, okay? In literature, an author can invent a symbol linking an object to a character or event. Why symbolism? All figurative language and stylistic devices are used to help convey the theme of the story. If you cannot figure out what a symbol stands for, think about the controlling ideas of the story, and your theme will lead you to understand the symbol. What does the scarlet ibis or ibis stand for? This bird is a rare, beautiful thing that is destroyed when it is blown out of its natural habitat. Doodle is also a rare, beautiful thing that is destroyed when his brother tries to make him do things that he cannot do, okay? Screech owls, casket, wreaths or circles or plants or flowers, okay? The storm, even colors, the color yellow, the color red, green, blue, black, white. All of this, you should have already figured this out. Spring, what does it mean? What does summer, fall, winter mean? An allegory is a story in which characters, settings, and actions stand for something beyond themselves. They can be abstract ideas such as democracy, truth, innocence, or they can be historical figures and events. Allegories can be read and interpreted on two levels: as a story that stands on its own, or as an allegory giving us lessons on life. You know what illusions are? There are several illusions in the story. You need to know them: historical, geographical, religion. I keep having to stop to let people in because they're late. Okay, this is a picture of a grindstone. It's a round stone used to grind grain into flour. It's also called a millstone, okay? Why was the grindstone important? The biblical allusion says that someone who hurts children or causes a child to sin should be punished with a millstone. A grindstone is a kind of millstone. So the narrator is partially responsible for the death of his brother, who is a child. Therefore, the allusion of the grindstone to a biblical idea of punishment is important to the theme of the story. Okay? Lots of allusions. Pay attention to quotes. Let's go back here to quotes. Some really meaningful quotes. I did not know then that pride is a wonderful, terrible thing, a seed that bears two vines, life and death. This metaphor compares the narrator's pride with a plant that can grow to be either a good or a bad thing. It's a good thing that he challenges Doodle and makes his life more beautiful, but it was deadly in the end. And then he said, there is within me, and with sadness I have watched it in others, a knot of cruelty born by the stream of love, much as our blood sometimes bears the seeds of our destruction, and at times I was mean to Doodle. The author uses this metaphor to show that the meanness of the narrator is tied up in him, but it's also connected to Doodle by the love that brothers share. It also foreshadows the destruction of Doodle. We'd bedeck ourselves with our handiwork and lull about this beautiful beyond the touch of the everyday world. If you remember when they went to the old woman's swamp and they made crowns and necklaces out of the flowers, okay, he said we would bedeck ourselves with our handiwork. This place was very beautiful. If you don't know what a swamp looks like, you should look it up and find a picture, okay? This was the poster project that you do not have to do. Okay, so that concludes this one. Now I have one more to show you. Okay, the Scarlet Ibis. He says, at times I was mean to Doodle. One day I took him up to the barn loft.
Slim,
Yes,
can you post this PowerPoint on SMS so we can study from it?
I won't post the ones that I just showed, and I'm not sure I'll post this one because it's not my job to give you the answers. You need to look them up and find them. At times I was mean to Doodle. One day I took him up to the barn loft and I showed him his casket, telling him how we all believed he would die. Who has not read this story? If you haven't, you better start reading. It's very long, and not only is it long, it's extremely detailed. The quiz will not be short on this story. Okay, the story is about two brothers, the narrator, which is the older brother, and Doodle, which is the younger brother, and he has severe physical disabilities. What is an ibis? It's a long-legged water bird related to the heron, the crane, and the stork. And it goes on to tell you there are plenty in Egypt. I don't know if there's a red one, but I know I've seen plenty here. That's a picture of one. Some of them are red as blood though, okay? Again, this is symbolism. Lots of symbols in this story. This is an example of the skull and the crossbones. What does it usually represent? Okay, here we have the summary. The story's first-person narrator relates a story from his past. His little brother Doodle is born physically disabled and he is expected to die, yet he lives. The narrator must care for his brother, taking him everywhere in a go-kart. He's often frustrated by this burden, but after much effort, he succeeds in teaching Doodle how to walk. Proud of his success, the narrator works to teach him how to run, how to swim, climb trees, and fight. In a symbolic episode that foreshadows the story's tragic resolution, Doodle buries a fallen bird, which is the brilliant Scarlet Ibis. Later that day, the strain of trying to learn physical skills leaves Doodle gravely weakened. And in the final scene, he collapses and dies while running to catch up with his brother who has left him in the middle of a thunderstorm. The narrator now feels guilty for his brother's death, and he discovers too late the extent of his feelings for his brother. Okay, any questions? None?
Miss Lynn,
Yes.
what is the casket?
The casket is the wooden box that they put people in to bury them. You know what I'm talking about, Sam?
Like the
Michelle?
coffin.
Yes, yes. The
Okay.
coffin.
Yes, exactly. Sorry. I didn't think you would understand coffin. Sorry. All right, what other questions? All right, let me put another screen up here. Can everyone see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Remember, when the story starts out, my book is a little bit different than yours. The very first paragraph is nothing but imagery, okay? But you have to read it carefully so you will understand it, okay? And then in the second paragraph, he goes on to tell us that it was very strange that all of that was so clear to him now. Remember, in the second paragraph, he is a grown man, okay? And he tells about how time has passed away. He tells about the grindstone, all right? He tells where he's sitting at in the cool green draped parlor, and the grindstone begins to turn. And with all its changes, is ground away, and he remembers Doodle. So then he goes on to explain about Doodle. He explains what happened when he was born. He explains how he got his name. Pay close attention. That he was expected to die. And then he explains how he felt. What kind of brother? He always wanted a brother, but he wanted a brother that could run with him and play with him and do sports with him, a normal brother. So when Doodle was born, that's what he got, okay? He tells how Doodle came about getting the name Doodle. And then he tells about he let his pride take over, and he told himself that he would teach Doodle to do all these things, okay? Remember, Doodle is very, very weak, all right? And on some days, it was extremely hard for Doodle to keep up with brother. However, Doodle adored his brother, okay? And remember, Mama makes him take Doodle with him everywhere he goes. She wanted Doodle, I think, to feel somewhat normal. And I guess she also wanted him to spend time with his brother, okay? And here brother says he was a burden in many ways because the doctor said he couldn't get too excited, he couldn't get too hot, too cold, too tired. In other words, he had to be treated very gently. Well, that was the opposite of how brother really treated him, okay? His skin was sensitive. He had to wear a big straw hat in the sun. But where was brother's favorite place to go?
Old Lady Swamp.
Yes, Old Woman Swamp, which was a beautiful place, okay? And in this paragraph, he tells all about the flowers, okay, that grows in Old Woman Swamp. And he would say, we would gather wallflowers, he named some of the flowers, and we would make them into necklaces and crowns, and then we would bedeck ourselves. They'd put them on their head, around their neck, okay? And then he tells something about himself. He says, there is within me, and with sadness, I have watched it in other people, a knot of cruelty born by the stream of love, much as our blood sometimes bears the seed of our destruction, and at times I was mean to Doodle. Do you believe that everybody is born with a small streak or maybe a large streak of cruelty in them?
Yes.
Hello? No one believes or can answer this? Y'all gonna have a tough time for a quiz.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, do you believe that every one of us is born with a streak of cruelty?
Yes.
No.
Who
Yes.
said yes?
Yes.
Who said yes?
Ahmed Bouta.
Ahmed, you're
Ahmed
right.
Bouta and Ahmed Magdi.
Yes, they're right. We all have a streak of cruelty in us, no matter if you admit it or not. There is sometimes in our lives when we all do mean things. You may not mean to, but there are times that we all do mean things, okay? One of the meanest things that brother did to Doodle was to take him up in the loft and show him his own coffin. Can you imagine? And you also have to stop and think. He explains that his dad had, or whoever, had covered the top of the loft. He had put Paris green everywhere in order to kill the rats. And throughout all these years, the screech owls had built a nest inside of the coffin. So when brother threatens Doodle about the coffin, and threatens to leave him there by himself if Doodle doesn't touch the coffin. Finally, Doodle reaches out to touch it, and when he touches it, he screams. And when he screams, it scared the screech owl, and it caused it to flop out of the box into their faces, and it spread the Paris green everywhere. At that point right there, Doodle could have died from being so afraid, okay? When Doodle was 5 years old, he said he was embarrassed about having a brother that couldn't walk, so he set out to teach him all this. So their journey began, okay? And at times, brother was very discouraged because he felt like Doodle wasn't moving along at a fast enough pace, okay? So he kept threatening Doodle with things like, don't you want to be like everybody else when you go to school? Don't you want to learn to walk? Different threats he would give him. Until finally, on someone's birthday, they decided that they would show the family that Doodle could take a couple of steps, okay? So sure enough, at breakfast that morning, they made this big to-do about how they wanted to surprise everyone. So he told them that he had a surprise for him. So all of a sudden, Doodle stands up, and of course, Mama began to cry, and she ran over and started hugging him, kissing him. So did Daddy and Aunt Nicey. Aunt Nicey was also thanks praying in the doorway, okay? And her and brother started dancing until she stepped on his big toe. Doodle told them it was him that had taught him to walk. So then everybody wanted to hug him, and he began to cry. However, the reason he was crying was much different than why all the rest of them was crying, okay? Then he starts to tell about he and brother started lying, okay? He said within a few months, Doodle had learned to walk well, and his go-kart was put up in the barn loft beside his little mahogany coffin. He said, now when we went off together, resting often, we never turned back until our destination had been reached, and to help pass the time, we took up lying, okay? And he says from the beginning, Doodle was a terrible liar, and he even started making brother get into the habit of lying. He said if anyone had stopped to listen to us, we would have been sent to Dix Hill. Dix Hill is a famous hospital for the mentally challenged people in North Carolina. He says his lies, talking about brother, his lies were scary and involved, but they were usually pointless. But Doodle's lies were twice as crazy. All the people in his stories had wings, and they flew wherever they wanted to go. And his favorite lie was about a boy named Peter who had a pet peacock with a 10-foot tail. Peter also wore a golden robe that glittered brightly, okay? And especially when he walked through the sunflowers, they turned away from the sun to face him. When Peter was ready to go to sleep, the peacock spread his magnificent tail and enfolded the boy gently, like a closing go-to-sleep flower, burying him in the gloriously iridescent, rustling vortex. He said, yes, I must admit it, Doodle could beat me lying, okay? Then he tells about how they would sit around and talk about their future, that they would live in Old Woman Swamp and pick flowers. He told how Doodle wanted to have chickens. And then Doodle suggested that Mama and Daddy could come live with them and that he could marry Mama and brother could marry Daddy. So this gives you an idea of how Doodle thought mentally, okay? So once brother had taught Doodle to walk, he felt then that he could do anything. He says, I began to believe in my own infallibility. In other words, he couldn't fail. And I prepared a terrific development program for him, of course, unknown to Mama and Daddy. I would teach him to run, to swim, to climb trees, to fight. And he too now believed in my infallibility. So we set the deadline for these accomplishments less than a year away, when it had been decided that Doodle could start to school, okay? He goes on to say that that winter they didn't make much progress because Doodle kept getting one cold after another. So when spring came, rich and warm, they were ready to go again. He said that success laid at the end of summer like a pot of gold. And our campaign got off to a good start. He tells on certain days what they did. And then he goes on to say that the summer of 1918 was blighted. In May and June, there was no rain and the crops withered, curled up, and died. And one morning in July, a hurricane came out of the east, tipping over the oak trees in the yard and splitting the limbs of the elm trees. That afternoon, it roared back out of the west, and it blew the fallen oaks around, snapping their roots, okay? Cotton bolls were wrenched from their stalks, and they lay like green walnuts in the valleys between the rows. So the cotton fields were destroyed. Almost everything was destroyed. Doodle and I followed Daddy out into the cotton field, where he stood with his shoulders sagging, surveying the ruin. When his cheek sank down into his chest, we were frightened, and Doodle slipped his hand into mine. Suddenly, Daddy straightened his shoulders, raised a giant knuckly fist, and with a voice that seemed to rumble out of the earth, he began cursing heaven, hell, the weather, and the Republican Party. Well, Doodle and Brother thought that was very funny, so they started laughing, okay? But they also knew that because their father made kind of a joke when he was cursing, that they went back into the house knowing that everything would be okay. Okay, and the next, there's lots of illusions, okay? So Brother keeps pushing Doodle every day, every day, every day. Then one day, Doodle began to look feverish, like he had a fever. So Mama felt his forehead, asking him if he felt ill. Because at night he didn't sleep well, and sometimes he had nightmares, crying out until I touched him and said, "Wake up, Doodle, wake up." So it was on a Saturday around noon, just a few days before school was to start. And he said, I should have already admitted defeat, but my pride wouldn't let me. The excitement of our program had now been gone for weeks, but we still kept on with a tired doggedness. It was too late to turn back, for we had both wandered too far into a net of expectations, and we had left no crumbs behind. So he goes on to tell that one morning or at lunchtime, Daddy, Mama, Doodle, and I were seated at the dining room table having lunch. It was a hot day and all the windows were open. Aunt Nicey was in the kitchen, and after a long silence, Daddy said, "It's so calm. I wouldn't be surprised if we had a storm this afternoon." But Mama said, "I haven't heard a rain frog." So she believed in signs. In other words, she was superstitious. Doodle speaks up and says, "I did down in the swamp." Remember, Doodle is not allowed to go to that swamp. And all this time, for almost a year, he's been going. Mom and Daddy, no one else knew about it. So he pops up and says that he heard a rain frog in the swamp. So Brother speaks up and says, "He didn't." "You did, huh?" said Daddy. "I certainly did," Doodle reiterated. And then all of a sudden came a strange croaking noise. Doodle stopped eating with a piece of bread ready in his mouth and said, "What's that?" He said, "I jumped up, knocking over my chair. And when I reached the door, Mama said, 'Pick up the chair, sit down again, and say, 'Excuse me.'" And by the time I had done this, Doodle had excused himself and slipped out in the yard. And as he was looking up into the bleeding tree, he says, "It's a great big red bird." So they all ended up going outside. They had never seen this bird before. So Daddy tells brother to go and get the bird book. So he goes and gets the bird book, and they finally find that it's a scarlet ibis, where the bird comes from. All right. So then there was a loud noise, and the poor bird falls to the ground. No, I'm sorry, it fell to the ground first. Then they found the bird book. All right, so they found that it's a scarlet ibis. And Mama suggests that they go back inside and finish their lunch. But Doodle said, "I'm not hungry." So Mama says, "But we've got peach cobbler for dessert." And Doodle tells her, "I'm going to bury him." Mama says, "Don't you dare touch him. There's no telling what disease he might have had." "All right," said Doodle, I won't. Daddy, Mama, and I went back to the dining room table, but we watched Doodle through the open door. He took out a piece of string from his pocket, and without touching the ibis, he looped one end around his neck. Slowly, while singing softly, "Shall we gather at the river?" he carried the bird around to the front yard, and he dug a hole in the flower garden. That song that he's singing, "Shall we gather at the river?" is a song that they sing in America for many people when they die. So he dug a hole in the flower garden next to the petunia bed. He said that as they were watching him through the front window, but he didn't know it. His awkwardness at digging the hole with a shovel, whose handle was twice as long as he was, made us laugh, and we covered our mouths. When Doodle came into the dining room, he found us seriously eating our cobbler. "Did you get the scarlet ibis buried?" asked Daddy. But Doodle didn't speak, he just nodded his head. So Mama tells him to go wash his hands so he could have some peach cobbler. He said, "I'm not hungry." Aunt Nicey speaks up and said, "Dead birds is bad luck, especially red dead birds." She's also superstitious. So as soon as they finished eating, Brother and Doodle hurried off to Horsehead Landing, okay? Now, Doodle doesn't talk. He just keeps putting his hand in the water, okay, as they're going along. He said he was too tired to swim, so they got into the skiff and Brother paddled. But after they had drifted a long way, Brother put the oars in place and he made Doodle row backward against the tide, which is even more difficult to row, okay? So when they reached Horsehead Landing, lightning was flashing across the sky and the thunder roared, okay? There was no sun, the sun disappeared. And he says that Doodle seemed to be both tired and frightened. And when he stepped from the skiff, he collapsed onto the mud, sending an armada of fiddler crabs rustling off into the marsh grass. He helped him up and he wiped the mud off of his trousers, and he smiled at me ashamedly. He had failed and we both knew it, so we started back home racing the storm. He says they never spoke. What are the words that can solder cracked pride? But I knew he was watching me for a sign of mercy. The lightning was near now, and from fear, he walked so close behind me, he kept stepping on my heels. The faster I walked, the faster he walked. So I began to run. The rain was coming, roaring through the pines. And then, like a bursting Roman candle, a gum tree ahead of us was shattered by a bolt of lightning. When the deafening peal of thunder had died, and in the moment before the rain arrived, I heard Doodle, who had fallen behind, cry out, "Brother, brother, don't leave me, don't leave me." The knowledge that Doodle's and my plans had come to naught was bitter, and that streak of cruelty within me awakened. I ran as fast as I could, leaving him far behind with a wall of rain dividing us. The drops stung my face like nettles, and the wind flared the wet, glistening leaves of the bordering trees. Soon I could hear his voice no more. I hadn't run too far before I became tired, and the flood of childish spite evanesced as well. I stopped and waited for Doodle. As I waited, I peered through the downpour, but no one came. Finally, I went back and found him huddled beneath a red nightshade bush beside the road. He was sitting on the ground, his face buried in his arms, which was resting on his drawn-up knees. "Let's go, Doodle," I said. He didn't answer, so I placed my hand on his forehead and lifted his head. Limply, he fell backward onto the earth. He had been bleeding from the mouth, and his neck and the front of his shirt were stained a brilliant red. "Doodle, Doodle," I cried, shaking him, but there was no answer but the ropey rain. He lay very awkwardly with his head thrown far back, making his vermilion neck appear unusually long and slim. His little legs, bent sharply at the knees, had never before seemed so fragile and so thin. I began to weep, and the tear-blurred vision in red before me looked very familiar. "Doodle!" I screamed above the pounding storm, and I threw my body to the earth above his. For a long, long time, it seemed forever, I lay there crying, sheltering my fallen scarlet Ibis from the heresy of rain. Any questions? Hello, are y'all with me?
Yes.
Yes.
It was a very
Yes.
sad story. Okay,
Definitely.
now, who do you compare Doodle with?
Scarlet Ibis.
Yes.
The Ibis.
Because if you look at how he describes Doodle and you go back and see how the Scarlet Ibis is described, you will see that they were almost exactly alike, okay? They were out of their element, even Doodle, because technically he was supposed to die according to the doctors. He was never supposed to be in that family even, okay? So, and you can see what he was like at his death, just like the Scarlet Ibis. Okay? Please just make sure that you know allusions and that you recognize them in the story. Make sure that you recognize not all of the imagery. I don't expect you to because there's way too much to even try to memorize, okay? But make sure you have a good understanding of imagery, okay? Superstitions, religion, lots of illusions, lots. So no one has any questions? Okay, if you don't have any questions, that will end our session. Make sure that you all have signed in for your attendance. All right, I'll see you on Sunday. Don't forget